August 12, 2000. The Barents Sea lay quiet and gray, a vast sheet of steel that shimmered beneath a pale northern sun. The wind barely stirred. Gulls hovered above the water, then drifted away, as if even they could sense something waiting beneath the surface. 250 kilometers from the coast of Norway, a submarine moved unseen through the cold. Its name was K-141 Kursk, a machine of power and pride, sliding through the Arctic depths like a shadow. Inside, the air smelled faintly of metal and oil. Pipes hummed, valves hissed. The rhythm of engines pulsed like a steady heartbeat through the hull. The men on board had grown used to that sound, a comfort, a reminder that the Kursk was alive. It was a Saturday. The second day of a massive naval exercise known as Summer X. 30 warships and 4 submarines filled the northern waters, their movements choreographed like a slow dance of steel. For Russia's Navy, battered by a decade of budget cuts and neglect, this was more than a drill. It was a declaration. We still endure. The Kursk carried 118 men, officers, engineers, cooks, mechanics, sailors. Some were veterans, others barely out of school. Many hadn't been paid in months. Still, they served with quiet loyalty. To them, the Kursk wasn't just a vessel. It was a symbol of a nation rising again after collapse. In the wardroom that morning, someone poured tea into tin cups. A birthday card passed around, signed in smudged ink. A few men joked about how long it would take before the next deployment. The atmosphere was light, routine, the sort of calm that comes when danger feels distant. Outside, the sea was mirror still. The captain noted the perfect visibility. The exercise would proceed as planned. By afternoon, they were to launch 2 training torpedoes toward the battle cruiser Pyotr Veliky. Dummy rounds, non-explosive, safe. Or so they believed. The Kursk had been built to survive almost anything. Her double hull was thick enough to shrug off torpedoes. Her design dated back to the late Soviet dream, a vessel meant to counter America's carrier groups, to strike unseen and vanish before retaliation. She was called unsinkable. A fortress beneath the waves. But on that calm August morning, small details began to align in ways no one could see. A hairline weld, a worn seal, a routine procedure about to turn deadly. At 11:29 a.m., the order came to load the first torpedo. 7 men moved carefully around the long cylinder, 35 feet of steel powered by hydrogen peroxide fuel. The process was familiar. They had done it dozens of times before. A faint hiss escaped the chamber. One man frowned, hearing it beneath the hum of compressors. He tapped a gauge, saw nothing wrong, and continued his work. Above them, the sunlight sparkled across the sea, a scene so tranquil that even the sonar operators aboard nearby ships grew bored, tracing only the faint pulse of the Kursk moving on schedule. At 11:31, a tremor would ripple through the seabed, a vibration strong enough to reach sensors in Norway, Iceland, and Alaska. But in that moment, no one yet knew. The ocean was still. The air in the submarine was warm, and the men who trusted their ship's steel walls were seconds away from meeting the one enemy no sailor can predict, the quiet, patient vengeance of the sea itself. Long before the calm of that August morning, the Kursk had been forged in another world, the dying breath of the Soviet Empire. In 1990, at the shipyards of Severodvinsk, her hull began to take shape beneath the orange glow of welding torches. Sparks fell like rain onto frozen ground as workers carved a vessel meant to outlive its nation. She was part of Project 949A Anti, the second generation of Oscar-class nuclear-powered cruise missile submarines. Her mission was simple, brutal, and clear: to hunt and destroy entire American carrier groups if war ever came. The engineers built her with double skin, an outer shell of nickel-chromium steel wrapped in 3 inches of rubber to absorb sonar. Inside that, a pressure hull of 50-millimeter high-strength steel. Between the two, a corridor of air and shadow. A second chance should the first skin be torn apart. 9 watertight compartments divided her interior. Each one could seal off death from the next, at least in theory. In truth, the sea rarely honors theory. At 155 meters long, she was larger than 2 passenger jets end to end, displacing 18,000 tons of water. Within those walls lived the hum of 2 nuclear reactors, each capable of driving her silently through the Arctic for 4 months without surfacing. She could break through ice, glide unseen beneath storm fronts, and strike from half a world away. Her weapons were terrifying: 24 P-700 Granite missiles that could think, swarm, and adjust mid-flight. They were designed not to miss. Even her torpedoes could carry nuclear warheads, though on paper they rarely did. Every bolt, every seam, every circuit whispered of a Cold War that had never truly ended. But as the Kursk neared completion, the Soviet Union collapsed. Funding vanished. Paychecks stopped. The workers kept going anyway, some for pride, some because they knew nothing else but the rhythm of steel on steel. By the time she was launched in 1994, the red flag was gone. The new Russian Federation inherited her, gleaming and immense, a relic of power too costly to build again. She became both a weapon and a symbol, a reminder to the world and to Russia itself that the fleet still had teeth. Her name, Kursk, was chosen deliberately, a tribute to the Battle of Kursk in 1943, the largest tank engagement in history, and the turning point of the war against Germany. It was meant to evoke strength, endurance, victory born from suffering. A submarine named for a city where thousands had once burned, now resurrected to patrol the cold north. For the sailors who served aboard her, she was more than metal. She was honor. Her very existence told them that Russia was not finished, that beneath the waves she was still powerful, still watching. When the Kursk first took to sea in 1999, she impressed everyone who saw her. During tests, she launched missiles flawlessly, her systems sharp, her crew eager. She earned a citation for excellence: Best Submarine Crew of the Northern Fleet. Even in a navy running on scraps, the Kursk shone. But pride can outlive preparation. Funding for maintenance was thin. Spare parts came from other decommissioned vessels. And beneath the paint and ceremony, small imperfections slept in her torpedo room, welds rushed to meet deadlines, seals that had aged without replacement. On the surface, she looked perfect. Inside, tiny fractures waited for pressure, heat, and time. A legacy of steel, yes, but also of exhaustion, pride, and the quiet decay of a nation still learning to breathe again. The Kursk was meant to prove that Russia could never be humbled. Yet deep below, the sea was patient. It always is. In the first light of August 10, 2000, the Northern Fleet stirred to life. Steel decks rang beneath boots. Flags snapped in the wind. After nearly a decade of neglect, Russia's Navy was finally on parade again. They called the exercise Summer X. It would be the largest training operation since the fall of the Soviet Union: 30 surface ships, 4 submarines, and more than 10,000 men. For the admirals, it was a show of rebirth. For the sailors, it was proof that their long-sleeping fleet could still breathe. When the Kursk slipped her moorings and glided out of Vidyayevo harbor, families lined the pier. Wives waved scarves in the cold air. Children ran along the seawall, chasing the shadow of the departing hull. No one doubted she would return. The Kursk had never failed. She had been called unsinkable so many times that the word no longer sounded like a boast. It sounded like a law. Inside the control room, Captain Gennady Lyachin studied his orders. His face was calm, composed. He had served his entire life beneath the Arctic ice and trusted the sea almost as much as he feared it. He reminded the crew, discipline first, pride second. Then he smiled, a small, tired smile that eased the tension in the room. The Kursk's mission in Summer X was simple. On the first day, she would launch a dummy granite missile, an enormous supersonic weapon, but armed only with a practice head. The test went perfectly. The missile streaked above the water and vanished over the horizon. Cheers echoed down the corridors. On the second day, August 12th, the submarine was scheduled to fire 2 dummy torpedoes at the battlecruiser Pyotr Veliki. It was routine, safe, controlled, the sort of drill that officers half-joked about in the mess hall. But even in that laughter, small worries lingered. The Type 65 Kit torpedoes were old, designed in another era. Their fuel, high-test peroxide, was dangerous, requiring careful storage and clean welding on every seam. Some engineers distrusted them, but replacements were scarce. The Navy's budget left no room for caution. Still, morale was high. In the galley, a cook played a cassette of folk songs through a dented radio. Sailors told stories about port visits that never happened and about the new century waiting beyond the horizon. For many of them, the Kursk was not just a posting. It was the best job they could ever hold. Far above, the Arctic sun skimmed the horizon, never setting, only dimming to a dull amber. The sea looked like polished lead. Each vessel in the exercise moved according to schedule: cruisers, destroyers, submarines, all linked by static-filled radio calls and coded pings of sonar. At 8:51 a.m., the Kursk requested permission to proceed with her training launch. The command ship confirmed. Everything appeared normal. Hours passed. The sea remained glass-still. At 11 a.m., crewmen in the torpedo room prepared the first practice round. They joked about the name Fat Girl, the nickname sailors gave the long silver weapon. It was nearly 5 tons, 35 feet of pressure, fuel, and precision. No one noticed the fatigue in the metal around the filler port. No one smelled the faint chemical sweetness of leaking HTP. Up on the surface, the Pyotr Veliki adjusted course, waiting for the training torpedo to race harmlessly beneath her hull. In the control tower, the exercise coordinator checked his watch and nodded. 2 minutes, he said. 2 minutes. Then silence. Across the fleet, no alarms were heard. The Kursk had gone quiet. Her last transmission, routine and unremarkable, still hung in the radio log. Preparing for training launch. What came next would not be training. It would be history. The torpedo room of the Kursk was a world of pressure and heat. 7 men worked in close quarters, their voices low, movements practiced. They were loading a Type 65 Kit torpedo, a massive silver cylinder powered by hydrogen peroxide fuel, clear as water, yet volatile as fire. At 11:29 a.m., they began to slide it into position. The hiss of compressed air mixed with the hum of the pumps. A routine procedure. They had done it 100 times before. Hours passed. The sea remained glass-still. At 11 a.m., crewmen in the torpedo room prepared the first practice round. They joked about the name Fat Girl, the nickname sailors gave the long silver weapon. It was nearly 5 tons, 35 feet of pressure, fuel, and precision. No one noticed the fatigue in the metal around the filler port. No one smelled the faint chemical sweetness of leaking HTP. Up on the surface, the Pyotr Veliki adjusted course, waiting for the training torpedo to race harmlessly beneath her hull. In the control tower, the exercise coordinator checked his watch and nodded. 2 minutes, he said. 2 minutes. Then silence. Across the fleet, no alarms were heard. The Kursk had gone quiet. Her last transmission, routine and unremarkable, still hung in the radio log. Preparing for training launch. What came next would not be training. It would be history. The torpedo room of the Kursk was a world of pressure and heat. 7 men worked in close quarters, their voices low, movements practiced. They were loading a Type 65 kit torpedo, a massive silver cylinder powered by hydrogen peroxide fuel, clear as water, yet volatile as fire. At 11:29 a.m., they began to slide it into position, the hiss of compressed air mixed with the hum of the pumps. A routine procedure. They had done it 100 times before. Somewhere in the seams of the weapon, a tiny weld had weakened. The metal was old, built in another decade, tested in another war. When the chamber flooded with seawater, droplets crept through that fault line and touched the peroxide. Hydrogen peroxide is harmless when stable, but when it meets a catalyst, a trace of copper, a film of oil, a bit of rust, it changes its nature. It expands 5,000 times, releasing steam and oxygen in a furious burst of energy. In a confined room of steel, there is nowhere for that energy to go. The first spark was invisible. Then came a pop, a sound like air escaping from a seal. And then came the blast. The explosion tore through the torpedo room with the force of 200 kilograms of TNT. Steel buckled, valves snapped, the air turned to fire. 7 men were gone before they had time to scream. Bulkhead doors groaned under pressure. Flame met oxygen and raced through open conduits into the next compartment. For a brief instant, the Kursk glowed from within, a flicker of orange behind her armor, gone as quickly as it came. In the control room, Captain Lyakhin gripped the rail as the deck shuddered. Alarms shrieked, lights flickered and died. For a moment, the crew thought they had collided with something beneath the surface, a foreign submarine, maybe a mine. But the tremor was coming from within. "Seal the forward hatch!" someone shouted. Men sprinted through narrow corridors, slamming levers into place. The fire roared like a storm trapped inside a box. Smoke poured through the vents, choking the air. The Kursk's ballast systems faltered. Electrical panels sparked. The captain ordered an emergency blow, a command that would flood the ballast tanks with air and force the submarine to rise. But the control circuits were already gone. Every attempt to reach the surface died with the power. Above them, nothing seemed wrong. The surface ships saw no oil slick, no debris, no distress flare. The Kursk was still on the sonar grid, her last ping recorded seconds before the blast. Then, silence. At 11:31 a.m., seismic monitors in Norway and Iceland picked up the shock. A 1.5 magnitude tremor, a blip so small that analysts assumed it was an undersea quake. They didn't know it was the sound of men dying in darkness. Inside the submarine, the fire devoured oxygen and fed on oil and paint. Temperatures reached 2,700 degrees Celsius. Pipes melted. The forward compartments became furnaces. Somewhere in the chaos, the automatic fire suppression system activated. It released freon gas, meant to starve flames of oxygen, but it also starved the men. Those still breathing collapsed where they stood. The Kursk was wounded, but not yet gone. For 2 minutes she drifted in agony, her bow burning while her stern remained cold. A heartbeat later, the heat reached the racks of live torpedoes waiting just beyond the fire-damaged bulkhead. The captain didn't know it yet, but time had already run out. The next explosion was coming, one so violent it would be felt half a continent away. And above, on the calm Barents Sea, no one saw a thing. The water barely rippled. The sky stayed pale and quiet. Only the gulls turned and fled, as if they had heard something too deep for human ears. The Kursk was burning, sealed in darkness, and the sea, as always, remained silent. 2 minutes passed. Then the ocean shook. The fire that had started in the torpedo room reached the forward racks. 7 fully armed torpedoes waiting behind the thin barrier of a bulkhead. The heat softened the steel. The pressure inside the warheads rose, searching for release. And at 11:31 a.m., release came. The second explosion ripped through the Kursk with the force of 7 tons of TNT. The bow disintegrated. A hole 22 feet wide tore open the submarine's skin. Compartments 1 through 4 collapsed inward as seawater poured in with the speed of sound. Nearly 1 million liters of Arctic water crashed through the wreck every second. Metal folded like paper. Valves screamed and burst. Men were vaporized, crushed, or swallowed whole before they could move. The blast was so massive it echoed across the entire Barents Sea. Sensors in Norway, Finland, and even Alaska recorded it. Seismic stations mistook it for an earthquake, its magnitude of 4.2 on the Richter scale. The ships nearest the Kursk felt the ocean heave beneath them. Sonar operators aboard the Pyotr Veliki registered a sudden acoustic spike, something like an underwater thunderclap, then silence. Their captain, assuming it was part of the training exercise, made no report. In the control rooms of the other vessels, men paused, waiting for the next communication from the Kursk. It never came. She had vanished from every channel, every sonar ping, every trace of life. Inside the submarine, the forward compartments were gone. The blast doors meant to protect the rest of the ship had failed. Fire and smoke rolled aft like a black tide. Bulkheads gave way one by one until the 5th compartment held the line. It was there, deep in the center of the ship, that silence returned. No light, no power, only the groan of a vessel that had lost its shape. For a few seconds, the stern remained buoyant, hovering between life and gravity. Then the Kursk began her descent. Her bow pointed down, as if bowing to the sea that had claimed her. Meters turned to fathoms. The pressure outside climbed. 5 atmospheres, 10, 20. Air inside the hull compressed, hissing through broken seams. At 354 feet, the Kursk struck the seabed. The impact drove her nose 70 feet into the mud. The propellers tilted skyward, half buried in silt. When the dust settled, the Arctic went quiet again. Above, the world continued unaware. The surface ships carried on their maneuvers, waiting for a signal that would never arrive. By 1:30 p.m., the Kursk was supposed to report completion of her drill. When she didn't, officers chalked it up to another communications failure. It wasn't the first time static had stolen a message. Evening came and the search began, half-hearted at first, cautious, then desperate. Helicopters traced grid lines over gray water. Sonar buoys dropped in waves. Nothing. At 10:30 that night, Nearly 12 hours after the first explosion, the Russian Northern Fleet declared an emergency. 20 vessels and 3,000 sailors began scouring the sea. They didn't know that what they were looking for had already become a tomb. Inside the wreck, the remaining compartments filled with smoke and silence. 49 men had been sealed behind the shattered midsection, cut off from the rest of the world. In the dark, they listened to the ocean pressing against the hull, to the faint sounds of metal settling and water hissing through seams. Somewhere among them was a captain still giving orders, a radio man still trying to reach the surface, and a handful of sailors who refused to believe it was over. The sea had taken everything but breath, and even that it would not allow for long. The Kursk had fallen. But in her shadow, 23 men still lived, trapped beneath the Arctic, waiting for a rescue that was already too late. When the noise stopped, silence felt wrong. It wasn't peace. It was pressure, metal, and disbelief. In the aft compartments of the Kursk, 23 men were still alive. They had felt both explosions, first a deep thud, then a detonation that ripped the world in half. Lights died, the floor pitched, then came the cold. They didn't know how far they had fallen, only that the bow was gone and the submarine had stopped moving. The air smelled of oil and smoke. Sparks drifted through the dark like tiny fireflies. Captain Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov took charge. He gathered the survivors in the 9th compartment, the very rear of the vessel, sealing bulkheads behind them as they went. Every hatch they closed felt like a burial. Each clang echoed through the steel, then was swallowed by the sea. The men spoke little. Their watches had stopped. Their ears rang. Someone whispered a prayer. Another joked weakly that the admiral would be furious when they finally surfaced late. For a few seconds, laughter flickered in the dark. It died quickly. They knew the front of the ship was gone. They could smell the burned air drifting aft. The heat had faded, but the memory of it lingered, the scent of scorched metal, the kind that clings to skin. Kolesnikov checked the gauges. Oxygen was dropping fast. The compartment was sealed tight, but it wouldn't stay that way forever. Seawater was finding cracks, creeping through seams. The temperature dropped toward freezing. In a locker near the wall, they found the chemical oxygen generators, small canisters that could feed breathable air back into the room. The crew had used them during drills, always careful. But now, in the dark, with oil and seawater everywhere, they had no choice but to trust them. Each canister worked by releasing oxygen through a chemical reaction, potassium superoxide meeting carbon dioxide. It kept them alive, but it also produced heat. Too much, and it could ignite. They took turns lighting one at a time. A hiss, a faint glow. For a moment the compartment brightened. They breathed easier. Above, the sea pressed harder. The hull groaned like an animal in pain. Men flinched at every sound, unsure if it meant help or collapse. Kolesnikov began writing in a notebook, his handwriting shaky in the dim light. He recorded names, compartments, the time of each explosion, his words a log for anyone who might find them. All personnel from sections 6, 7, and 8 have moved here, he wrote. None of us can escape. Hours passed. They shared sips of water, whispered about families, tried not to imagine what was happening above. Each breath grew heavier. The hiss of the oxygen units slowed. Then, while trying to recharge one of the generators, something went wrong. A cartridge slipped from Kolesnikov's hand and fell into the shallow pool at their feet. Seawater mixed with oil. The reaction was instant. White fire erupted. A blinding flash. Heat filled the room. Those nearest the flame were burned before they could move. The rest dove beneath the rising water to escape the blast, their screams muffled into silence. The flame consumed what oxygen remained. Within minutes, breathing became impossible. Some suffocated, others drowned, unwilling to surface into fire. Kolesnikov was found later, his note pressed inside his suit pocket. The ink had blurred, but the last words could still be read. Here are the list of men from the 9th compartment. It's dark here to write, but I'm trying by touch. I think none of us will survive. Don't despair. By then, the Arctic had gone quiet again. 23 hearts had beaten their last beneath the waves, and on the surface the search was only just beginning. On the surface, the Barents Sea was calm. Too calm. Ships from the Northern Fleet traced circles above the coordinates where the Kursk had vanished. The water gave nothing back, no oil, no debris, no sign of life. At first, no one panicked. Communication failures were common during long dives. The officers on the command ship assumed the submarine had simply lost radio contact. Hours passed. Then evening came, and still nothing. At 5 p.m., the fleet's first reconnaissance plane flew low over the sea, scanning the surface for bubbles or wreckage. The pilot saw only smooth water, unbroken as stone. When night fell, the search expanded. Helicopters traced grid lines across the horizon. Messages flashed between ships in short bursts of static. No contact, no pings. By midnight it was clear something terrible had happened. But in the Russian Navy, bad news traveled slowly. The admiral of the Northern Fleet, Vyacheslav Popov, reported the incident to Moscow, but the message was softened. Communication lost, possible malfunction. The truth, an explosion, seismic activity, total silence, was not yet spoken aloud. When the Kursk failed to surface for its scheduled check-in at dawn, Popov ordered a full-scale rescue operation. The fleet's specialized rescue ship, Mikhail Rudnitsky, was deployed with 2 deep submergence vehicles capable of diving to the seabed. By then, it had been 20 hours since the explosions. Below, the oxygen was long gone. At 10:30 a.m., divers aboard the Rudnitsky found a sonar contact on the ocean floor, large, metallic, motionless. They had found her. The Kursk. The first submersible descended slowly through the gray water. Its floodlights pierced the dark until the massive shape emerged, a broken hull, tilted, half buried in silt. The divers saw the shattered bow, twisted metal, and one raised periscope frozen mid-ascent. The damage was beyond comprehension. But hope is stubborn. They searched for signs of life, banging, movement, anything. At one point, sonar operators thought they heard faint tapping from within the wreck. The signal was rhythmic, human. But by the time the divers reached the hull, the sound had stopped. The rescue team tried to attach a docking collar to the submarine's hatch, but the metal was warped and covered in mud. Every attempt failed. They returned to the surface to refit their tools. Hours turned into days. On August 14th, as the world began to notice the growing silence, Russia's Navy finally made a public statement. The Kursk has experienced technical difficulties. Communication is established. Air and power are being supplied to the crew. None of it was true. Other nations, Britain, Norway, the United States, offered to help. They had advanced submersibles, trained crews, equipment that could reach the wreck within hours. The Russian government refused them. Pride, secrecy, politics. The same forces that built the Kursk now sealed her fate. For 5 days, official statements painted a picture of control. Television broadcasts showed admirals smiling. Reporters were told the crew was safe. But at home, families of the sailors knew otherwise. They gathered at the naval base in Vidyayevo, clutching photographs, waiting for answers that never came. Rumors spread through the base like wildfire. Some said the submarine had collided with a NATO vessel. Others whispered of a nuclear accident. The truth was simpler and crueler. By the time Norway's offer of assistance was finally accepted, it was August 20th, 8 days after the explosion. The Norwegian divers descended into the wreck and confirmed what everyone feared. No one had survived. The compartment walls were torn open, the air pockets gone. Bodies floated in silence among the wreckage, faces calm, hands still. Every clock on board had stopped at the same time. 11:32 a.m. On the surface, the sea was motionless again. The searchlights dimmed, engines powered down. The rescue had come. But there was no one left to save. The announcement came on August 21st, 2000. 9 days after the explosions, the Russian Navy spoke the words the world had already guessed. The Kursk is lost. All 118 men are dead. Across Russia, silence fell. In cities and small towns, flags dropped to half-mast. At the naval base in Vidyayevo, families gathered in the cold wind, holding photographs of the men they had loved. Some wept quietly, others shouted for answers. The sea gave them none. 5 days earlier, President Vladimir Putin had been informed of the accident. He did not return from his holiday immediately. The delay became a wound that would never quite heal. When he finally met the grieving families, the room trembled with anger. A mother stood up and screamed, "Why have you murdered our sons?" Another woman cried, "When will you bring them home?" Putin tried to speak words about malfunction, about secrecy, about hope, but each sentence was drowned in grief. One woman collapsed. Another, overcome with rage, was sedated on live television. That footage never aired in Russia. Outside, the media called it a failure of pride. The government called it a tragedy of fate. But the truth, discovered in the months that followed, was simpler and harder to bear. The dummy torpedo that caused the first explosion had been more than a decade old. Its welds were poor. Its fuel seals were leaking even before the exercise began. Engineers had warned of it. Officers had noted it. But orders were orders. The Kursk would sail anyway. When investigators recovered the wreck, they found the remains of the torpedo room mangled, scorched, and twisted. Near it, a single fragment of the practice round revealed the truth. The weld around its fuel tank had failed. The leak had mixed with air, oil, and rust. Hydrogen peroxide had met a catalyst, and the sea had done the rest. The official report called it a technical malfunction. No charges were filed. No one was blamed. Each of the 118 men was posthumously awarded the Order of Courage. Captain Gennady Lyakin received the title Hero of Russia. Their families were promised compensation, homes, and free education for their children. But none of it could fill the space they left behind. In October 2001, a massive Dutch crane lifted the Kursk from the seabed. The world watched as the hull broke the surface, dripping with silt and salt water. 1,000 tons of metal rose into the light for the first time in 14 months. When the wreck was brought ashore, divers entered its silent halls. They found the notes still in Kolesnikov's pocket. Water damaged, words barely visible, but unmistakable. All personnel from sections 6, 7, and 8 have moved here. None of us can escape. He had written it calmly, as though recording history rather than dying inside it. Today, a memorial stands in Murmansk, carved from dark granite. A sailor's bell rests atop the stone. Each year, families return to that spot, laying flowers and wreaths. Some kneel, some touch the names carved into the wall. Others just listen. To the wind, to the sea, to the faint hum of engines that exist only in memory. No one who visits leaves without feeling the weight of it, not just the loss of a ship, but the quiet warning it left behind. That pride can sink more than steel. That sometimes a nation's silence is louder than its grief. When the Arctic sun dips low over the horizon, the Barents Sea glows silver again. The waves roll over the place where the Kursk rests, gentle and indifferent. There is no sound, no wreckage, no trace of the fire that once lit the water from below. Only the memory remains, steady as the tide, patient as the ocean. For the sea forgets no names. It only keeps them.